And I might have just accidentally kicked them all off. So, you know, I'm doing real well. Jesus, guys. Okay. Hopefully they'll rejoin. Alrighty. Okay, so we saw a little bit of a depiction of what that looks like. And now we have another video of someone's experience with generalized anxiety.
My name is Will Wheaton. I am an actor, writer, and producer. I have generalized anxiety disorder, and I have I forget the exact medical term for it, but it's sort of like chronic depression. I wasn't aware of how my mental illness was affecting me until I've been suffering from it for easily 15 or 20 years.
Oops. So again, people often suffer for quite a long time before they get a diagnosis. Thanks Zoom people for signing back on. Unintentionally, I kicked you all off. So thank you for coming back. Alrighty, so GAD symptoms are what we're going to talk about next, and the diagnosis itself. Okay. So these are the criteria. You've got to have excessive anxiety and worry for at least 6 months. It's not just because like one stressful thing is going on in your life, right? It's that this is a pervasive pattern that you've been seeing throughout your life. It's difficult to control this anxiety once it starts. It's not like you can just be like, oh, I'll just stop. And then you have to have 3 or more of the following of these symptoms. So breathlessness, just feeling like you can't sit still, feeling like you're on edge, fatigue. Insomnia can be a part of this. You see this from sleep disturbance. So you get some fatigue from that, but also from just worrying all the time. Difficulty concentrating, focusing, irritability with those around you, with your situation, with yourself. And then muscle tension. They're so worked up or keyed up all the time, they can actually like get muscle pain from that. You gotta have significant distress or impairment. And interestingly, because as you can see, some of these symptoms overlap with depression, you can't be diagnosed with GAD and depression starting at the exact same time. Basically, they have to choose one or the other. But if you've always been a worrier, and you just started having a major depressive episode, you can be diagnosed with both. Basically, we don't want to over-pathologize things with overlapping symptoms that start at the same time. So worry is this primary feature of GAD. And worry does serve a function. There's a reason everyone worries, right? So we know that it is more in thoughts than images. So worry tends to not let us picture things as much. Worry can reduce that physiological arousal. So it can help us feel less like our heart is racing, things along those lines. But because we're thinking more in thoughts, we can fail to process the emotional component of what we're thinking about. So one of the theories is that people who suffer from GAD worry to lessen their physical and emotional discomfort in the short term. So basically worry itself is a form of avoidance. And we know that avoidance is reinforcing because you're taking away something someone doesn't like. It's that negative reinforcement. Some statistics about GAD, about 4% of the general population meet diagnostic criteria. Females outnumber males approximately 2 to 1. And it's unclear whether this replicates some of the stuff we talked about with depression, right? Where it might be, we're actually just diagnosing women more often than men. Onset is insidious. So again, they might have always been a worrier, and then there's something that kind of pushes it over the edge to be full criteria. And we know that just being anxious runs in families, and that might manifest with different disorders in different people. So each of our perspectives talks about how to explain GAD, just as it did with mood disorders. So according to the sociocultural perspective, GAD is most likely to develop in people faced with social conditions that are truly dangerous, where like it's adaptive for them to worry. And there is research to support this theory. So for example, I don't know how many people have heard of the 3 Mile Island incident. It was a nuclear power plant that suffered a partial failure, and contamination was spread. As with many of these things, they weren't real clear with people how much was spread. It's very similar to what's happening in East Palestine, Ohio right now, right? But they know that people who lived on 3 Mile Island were much more likely to develop GAD. There was 5 times as much anxiety and depression in general as compared to the general population. One of the most powerful forms of social stress is poverty. Well, we know that rundown communities, higher crime rates, fewer educational and job opportunities, and greater risks for health problems all go with poverty. So when people try to blame things like health factors on race, a lot of times it's tied with not having access to food. There are places called food deserts, for example, wherein your only place you can walk to get food might be a 7-Eleven, right? Like, how are you going to get fresh produce then? I mean, some of them has some produce. I don't know if you want to eat it all the time, right? As would be predicted by this model, there are higher rates of GAD in groups that have lower socioeconomic status. And since race is closely tied to income and job opportunities, as I was just mentioning, it's also tied to the prevalence of GAD. So about 3.1% of folks who are European American, Caucasian, suffer from GAD, and about 6% of people who are Black African American. And African American women have the highest rates. Although poverty and other social pressures may create a climate for GAD, other factors are clearly at work. And we know this because lots of people living in these environments don't develop GAD. Now, in terms of the psychodynamic perspective, Freud believed everybody experiences anxiety, even from childhood. He talked about different types of anxiety. So realistic or reality anxiety is when you're faced with actual danger. Neurotic anxiety is when you're prevented from expressing your id impulses. And moral anxiety is when you're punished for expressing those id impulses. And one can use ego defense mechanisms to control these forms of anxiety, but when they don't work or when anxiety is just too high for defense mechanisms, that's when GAD would develop. Researchers have actually found some support for the psychodynamic perspective here. So people with GAD are particularly likely to use defense mechanisms, particularly things like repression, where you try just not to think about something. And children who were severely punished for expressing id impulses, children that had higher levels of neurotic anxiety, have higher levels of anxiety later in life. Are these results proof of the model's validity? Not necessarily. There are alternative explanations of the data. Discomfort with painful memories or forgetting in therapy is not necessarily defensive. And also, some data actually contradict the model. In fact, many, if not most GAD clients report normal childhood upbringings. And now therapy here is going to be the same basic techniques. We're going to be doing free association, dream interpretation, therapist interpretation. But in GAD in particular, Freudians are going to focus less on fear and more on control of those id impulses. And there's a subset of Freudian or psychodynamic therapists called objects relations therapists. And they will help patients identify and settle early relationship conflicts. Overall, controlled research has not consistently shown that psychodynamic approaches are actually helpful in treating GAD. And short-term dynamic therapy, though, may be beneficial in some cases. Now, from the humanistic perspective, Theorists propose that GAD, like other psychological disorders, arises when people stop looking at themselves honestly and acceptingly. And this view is best illustrated by Carl Rogers' explanation, where he said the lack of unconditional positive regard in childhood, the lack of just, support no matter what, leads to what they call conditions of worth or harsh self-standards. These threatening self-judgments break through and cause anxiety, which sets the stage for GAD to develop. Therapy based on this model is client-centered and focuses on creating an accepting environment where clients can experience themselves as they are. Case reports have been positive, but controlled studies have only sometimes found this to be more effective than placebo or no therapy at all. And there's only limited support for Rogers' explanation of these causal factors. Now, the cognitive perspective argues that psychological problems are caused by maladaptive and dysfunctional thinking, just as we saw with mood disorders and our general overview. And since GAD is characterized by worry, which in and of itself is a cognition, this model is a good story. It's a good start. So again, the theory here is that GAD might be caused by these maladaptive assumptions. Albert Ellis himself identified some basic irrational assumptions, like it's necessary for humans to be loved by everyone. There's always going to be someone who doesn't like you for no good reason, right? We've all had that experience. It is catastrophic when things are not as one wants them to be. If something is dangerous, a person should be terribly concerned and dwell on the possibility that it will occur. I mean, you could do that, doesn't really help, right? Aaron Beck, on the other hand, and basically, Ellis said when these assumptions are applied to everyday life, GAD develops. Aaron Beck said that those with GAD held unrealistic silent assumptions that imply imminent danger, that any strange situation is dangerous and a situation or person is unsafe until proven safe. Research supports the presence of these types of assumptions in GAD, particularly about dangerousness, and what kinds of people are likely to have exaggerated expectations of danger, those whose lives have been filled with unpredictable negative events. To avoid being blindsided again in the future, they try to predict events. They look everywhere for danger, and unfortunately, that means they see danger everywhere. This theory is still under investigation, and in fact, there are some second-generation cognitive explanations. So metacognitive theory was developed by a researcher named Wells, and it holds that the most problematic in assumptions in GAD are the individuals worrying about worry itself. So it's really ugly. Metacognition in general, like thinking about thinking, remembering about remembering, is like really hard to wrap your head around sometimes, right? But like people with GAD will worry about worry, right? They worry, oh, is this worry causing me extra stress? And is that bringing my blood pressure up? Is that going to mean I can't sleep tonight? Avoidance theory is developed by a researcher named Borkovac, and it holds that worry serves a positive function for those with GAD by reducing those high levels of bodily arousal, which we mentioned previously, so that negative reinforcement. When I think it was our first year in grad school, I got to see Borkovac talk. He is a character. He just quoted lines from like 70s rock songs at us. He's this like little skinny spry man, and he would like pitch his leg up on the desk that was like this high while he was talking to us. But very intelligent, very interesting theory. And there's research support for both that and metacognitive theory. So how do you change maladaptive assumptions? Both Ellis and Beck's therapies just focus on this, right? Doing thought records, doing ABC sheets. You also can help clients understand the special role that worrying plays and change their views about it. So in Ellis's RET or REBT, they point out irrational assumptions. They suggest more appropriate assumptions. They assign related homework. Ellis has less research. He was more of a practitioner, but what research does exist supports it. Beck is very similar to his depression treatment. And it's shown to be somewhat helpful in reducing anxiety to tolerable levels. So when you start to try to explain worry in general, the first thing you do is what's called psychoeducation. So you help the person understand a lot of what I'm telling y'all about the function of worry and why people with GAD worry so much. You'll assign self-monitoring of somatic arousal and cognitive responses. So as therapy progresses, clients become increasingly skilled at identifying their worrying and its counterproductivity. And with continued practice, clients are expected to see the world as less threatening, to adopt more constructive ways of coping, and to worry less. And research has begun to indicate that a concentrated focus on worrying in particular is a really helpful addition, like it makes the therapy that much better. All right, now in terms of the biological perspective, there are genetic factors at play here supported by family pedigree studies. Blood relatives of people with GAD are much more likely to have GAD. So about 15% of them have GAD, whereas the general population is somewhere around 3% to 6%. And the closer the relative, the greater the likelihood they both have GAD. Of course, as we mentioned previously, we also need to take into account the issue of shared environment in their scenarios. There also seems to be a functional deficiency of that neurotransmitter GABA. And in the 1950s, benzodiazepines, which are medicines like Valium and Xanax, were found to reduce anxiety. Now, like a little bit of a side note, but these became very popular because a lot of women developed worry and depression around this time for a whole host of reasons. Many women had jobs during World War II, and then when the men came back over, they said, oh, it's your job now to be in the home. Some of those women had gotten college degrees, and now we're not using them. And so these were prescribed so often to housewives that they were actually called mother's little helper. Yeah, we don't do that anymore as much. It's pretty good. And so it seems like there's some problems with the feedback system for GABA. So benzodiazepine receptors ordinarily receive GABA, and GABA is an inhibitory messenger. So when it's received by a neuron, it tells the neuron, don't fire, don't pass on any message. In the normal fear reaction, key neurons fire more rapidly, creating that general state of excitability, experiences fear or anxiety. And then there's a feedback system that's triggered, and the brain and body work together to try to reduce that excitability. Some neurons release GABA to inhibit neuron firing, thereby reducing experience of fear and anxiety. And so if GABA is not being released, if it's not providing that feedback, then you're just sort of stuck, right? And there's always sort of feeling a little bit keyed up, a little on edge. So it may be possible that people just have too little GABA or too few receptors for the GABA on that receiving neuron, or that the receptors are there, but they're just not working efficiently. So there's a whole host of anti-anxiety treatments, anxiolytics, you'll hear them called sometimes. So I already mentioned the benzodiazepines, Valium, Xanax, Ativan. These are really commonly prescribed, less so now that there are other things that work well. Something like Buspar is another popular drug name. But now, just like depression, a lot of times what we're prescribing is SSRIs, like Paxil or Effexor or Zoloft. And that's because serotonin also seems to be implicated in anxiety. And so these are effective. You're less likely to overdose on them. You can take them in lower doses. And so they've become sort of the treatment of choice. Another one that's really popular is Lexapro. So I know Lexapro is like super low dose. It's like 10 or 20 milligrams. And so people are very comfortable taking that. All right, the next video I have, one of my professors referred to this as, you owe it to your family to take Paxil. So I'm gonna play it and let you guys see.
The kids are fine. Why are you always so anxious? Dad, you're always so tense. Are you mad at me?
Honey, you can't keep losing sleep. It makes you so irritable.
You worry constantly. Can't we have a relaxing dinner anymore?
Chronic anxiety can affect your relationships, your work, your life. If you're one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame. Paxil, the most prescribed medication of its kind for generalized anxiety, works to correct this imbalance. Prescription Paxil is not for everyone. Tell your doctor what medicines you're taking. People taking MAOIs or thiaridazine should not take Paxil. Side effects may include decreased appetite, dry mouth, sweating, nausea, constipation, sexual side effects, tremor, fatigue, or sleepiness. With the help of Paxil, you can see someone you haven't seen in a while. Yourself.
Hey, I remember you.
So yeah, let's guilt people into taking an SSRI. Because you owe it to your family not to be distressed. I don't know. I mean, like, yes, it will help you, but what a weird way to advertise something by guilt. I mean, I guess they're sort of playing out what people with GAD have, right, at that point in time, unfortunately. So there's a couple of these throughout this lecture, and these are just comprehensive models that sort of explain all the different factors that might come into play with the different anxiety disorders. So here you see how you might have both a biological and psychological vulnerability, probably some stress, probably some false alarms about that stress, anxious apprehension, that muscle tension, the vigilance, worrying, cognitive processing, avoidance of imagery, not having problem-solving skills, that autonomic response, that all is going to feed into GAD. All right, so the next set of anxiety disorders we're going to start talking about are phobias. And phobias are also very common. And a phobia is a persistent fear of some sort of object or situation that presents little to no actual danger. An individual with a phobia will go to great lengths to avoid whatever that feared object is. And the phobia tends to interfere with normal functioning. A phobia is a fear-mediated avoidance that is out of proportion with the object or situation. So you're afraid of something that, like, maybe you should be afraid of a little, but it goes to an extreme. An example is snakes, right? It's understandable to be petrified of the snakes that can kill you. Like if you live in Australia, I don't know if a snake phobia is a phobia, right? Because pretty much every snake in Australia can kill you. But if you live around here and you see garter snakes and rat snakes most of the time, it's out of proportion, right? Because those can't hurt you. And in fact, they're helpful. They eat the mice and the rats and other pests, right? So there are three main categories of phobia in the DSM. And the one that people tend to think of when they think of phobias is specific phobic disorder or specific phobia. These types of phobias may involve fears of certain situations in the environment, like water, bridges, heights, or certain species. I mentioned snakes or spiders, things along those lines. The second category is social anxiety disorder. This actually used to be called social phobia. And these involve fear of social situation in which a person is exposed to the scrutiny of others and is afraid of acting in a humiliating or embarrassing manner. The third category is agoraphobia, which translates to fear of the marketplace. People with agoraphobia most often have anxiety about having some sort of attack, whether it's a panic attack, a seizure, another type of attack in a public place where they can't escape, and that will ultimately cause embarrassment. So specific phobias are persistent, unrealistic fears of, again, objects, places, or situations. And when individuals have been confronted with that feared stimulus, they'll experience an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. There are 5 subtypes. So animals, so in addition to snakes and spiders, some people, for example, are afraid of dogs. Natural environment, heights, water. Blood injection injury, so these are people with fear of needles, fear of blood, other injuries. Situational, fear of airplanes, fear of elevators. This is where claustrophobia would fall, fear of close places. And then the other category, as you can imagine, is pretty random, but it can include things like fear of choking or fear of vomiting. Avoidance, maybe not surprisingly, is one of the important key features of phobias. People will avoid the feared stimulus in order basically to not experience that fear and dread. The avoidance behavior is reinforcing, again, through negative reinforcement. So they avoid the feared stimulus, and that's reinforcing, so they'll avoid it even more because they realize it will reduce that fear response. And phobias are also sometimes maintained by secondary gains. So for example, if you're getting some sort of disability benefits from your phobia, it can be hard to want to change. Yeah.
Can these fears be both learned and like in yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good, so yeah, a lot of these, so if we think of like water, snakes, spiders, at one point, these were really adaptive, right? So like, we didn't have anti-venom for a long part of human history. So if you got bit by a snake, you were probably going to die, right? Early humanoids, particularly like Neanderthals, had a harder time swimming than like Homo sapiens sapiens like we do. So fear of water made sense, right? So there is some evidence that there's like an evolutionary component to some of these. And then for some people, exactly what you're saying, they're social. So like a lot of the people who have a fear of dogs, for example, were like bitten by a dog as a kid or something along those lines. So like to them, it makes sense. No, actually, I mean, it would depend on the modality, but generally what you do with phobias is get the person to be exposed to the feared stimulus in a safe way. So they realize it's okay. So you would do that regardless of whether it was evolutionary or something you learned, basically. But yeah, really, really, really good questions. Yeah. I mean, and so that's why, like, I don't know if anyone here has taken EbPsych with Dr. Martel. She teaches a class on evolutionary psych, but like, there's a reason why we're more afraid of snakes than guns, right? Even though guns are much more likely to kill us, it's because we didn't have guns for a large portion of our evolutionary history, right? Humanoids have been around for millions of years. Guns were invented like a few hundred years ago, right? So we haven't evolved that fear in the same way. We certainly can learn it, but it's not as instinctual. So these are the DSM criteria. So you've got to have that marked, persistent, and disproportionate fear of that specific object. Again, like if you live in the Australian outback, and you're afraid of snakes, you probably won't be classified as having snake phobia because that is keeping you alive, right? But if you live here, maybe, right? Immediate anxiety, produced by exposure to the object, avoidance of anything that reminds you of the object. I had a elementary school teacher who had a phobia of snakes. And she was like looking through a National Geographic one day, and luckily it was after school, so we weren't in the classroom. But there was a picture of a snake, and apparently she actually like chucked it across the room. So again, luckily the students weren't there, so she didn't like hit any of us in the head, right? But it was like, she didn't make that conscious decision, her body just did it. And so it's going to cause significant distress or impairment. So what causes specific phobias? Here there's less fleshed out ideas. We all kind of tend to converge on one idea or another. So psychoanalytic theory says that you have some sort of anxiety that's being displaced onto that object or situation. Cognitive theory is going to focus in on those maladaptive thought processes that result in a high level of anxiety. Behavioral theorists will focus on learning as the ideological basis of phobias. So they're learned avoidance responses, and sometimes they're acquired through modeling, right? If someone like our mother or our, babysitter is afraid of something, we may become afraid of it too. And then biological theories, prepared learning of fear and phobias through evolution. Again, there are ideas that our evolutionary history has made us more prepared for developing fears to certain objects than others. Just like we talked about, fears of snakes, water, and heights were adaptive. Because people who didn't fear those things died, right? When we were like cave people. So the ancestors who feared the threats and avoided the threats like snakes, water, heights, spiders were the ones who survived. Because at that time, those fears were more real and life-threatening than they are today. So that's why people argue that they're more likely to develop these fears of some objects rather than others. There also do seem to be some genetic and temperamental causal factors as well. Now, how do we treat specific phobias? As I mentioned, you kind of are doing exposure no matter what. And we often do this through a system called systematic desensitization. For systematic desensitization, you have people create a hierarchy of their fears. So let's say my phobia was snakes. Probably at the low end of the phobia would be, like standing at the doorway and the snake's in a very locked container over on this corner of the room, right? And the thing that'd be scariest for me would be holding the snake myself. And then what you do is you work through that hierarchy via exposure. Exposure is confrontation with your feared stimulus. And part of what you do in therapy is what this guy's doing. You model. And so the therapist actually models handling the snake, engaging in riding an elevator, whatever your fear is. And then there is another way you can do this, and it's very effective, but it's not done as often. And I honestly think, as someone who's a former therapist, this is not done as often because of the distress it causes the therapist more than anything else. And this is flooding, which is you move immediately to the highest level of your fear hierarchy. You got a fear of snakes, we're gonna move you across the room, take that snake out of there and hand it to you. And the idea is you kind of like get over it all at once. Now, all of these would be paired with things like relaxation techniques. So you wouldn't just sort of like throw them to the wolves. So here's an example of that hierarchy, right? That fear seems really big at the top of the hierarchy. So you're going to expose them to it. This is that systematic desensitization. Expose them to it in a graded fashion. You would have specific goals and break them into smaller manageable steps. So maybe I start by just looking at it across the room. And then I get closer and eventually I can like look at the tank, right, but not actually touch it. And then we work up to having the tank open and eventually to the therapist holding it and then me holding it. So you learn to master situations that cause mild anxiety first, and then you get reinforcement from that. And you can get greater anxiety because you build confidence. As I mentioned, you would teach and test a relaxation strategy beforehand. Oftentimes, this is something like diaphragmatic breathing. That's really easy to do in the moment, muscle relaxation. And so if the person starts to get anxious during the session, you stop, you do the relaxation together. So the aim is to not only be exposed, but to get to a point where you have relative relaxation before you progress. And the idea is by the time you get to the top, even that top of your hierarchy isn't so scary, isn't so big. And so the really cool thing that we've been doing with technology in more recent years is they're using VR to cure phobias. And so this is a video explaining that process. In case you're wondering what I'm doing on my phone, I'm emailing the help desk.
Do you feel like this is something that's really impacting your life in a big way, like interfering with your ability to do your work?
I was doing this interview with John Cho.
We all good? we decided for some reason we were going to do it at the top of this building. I did it. I couldn't refuse. I mean, it's my job.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's kind of hard to explain, but I have a fear of heights. I feel like it's not like a normal fear of heights. I'm worried that I will jump off of things, basically, is what happens.
Regardless of whether or not it's fear of heights or, a form of OCD, the good news is that this sort of issue is one of the most effectively treatable conditions, not just in mental health, but also in all of healthcare.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
That conversation was real. What's not so real is the way Dr. Aronovich wants to treat me. He's one of about 200 therapists testing a new virtual reality platform with his patients. Most people have only used VR to play video games. But now that VR technology is getting cheaper, people are starting to use it for other things, like therapy. Limbix, a small startup in Palo Alto, is developing VR experiences that mimic real life.
Maybe you can tell me what you're seeing right now. It's a good place to start.
Welcome to Limbix VR. Take a moment to adjust your headset, get comfortable, and prepare for therapy.
Like this driving scenario with variable intensity and danger. The idea is that if someone's afraid of something, the best way to treat them is to gradually expose them to it. And over time, their fear will get less intense, or even go away.
What other kind of environments do you have that you've already put together?
So public speaking is obviously a really common anxiety for people. If you want, you can stand up in front of the crowd, you can look around in all directions, see your presentation, and then once the therapist decides, okay, Dexter's comfortable talking in front of this positive, casual audience, you can then make the audience angry. Right? We're distracted, we're angry, we're not really paying attention.
Right. I would not have thought of this one. I mean, heights, yes. Cars, sure. This is a little bit off the beaten path.
Limbix's long-term plan is to sell its software to large institutions like VA hospitals and drug and alcohol treatment clinics. So far, Limbix has $3 million in VC funding, and they're 6 months into their testing program with therapists.
So, are you seeing something?
Yes, looks like sand, maybe a beach.
Yeah, great. If you're feeling comfortable, my plan would be to kind of take it up a notch.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, I think this one might be a good option.
Take it to the edge here.
Nope. Nope.
Okay.
I would never do this in real life.
Okay, what's the suds right now?
The sense is, why am I here?
Okay, hold on 1 second. I think you should be transported to a bridge.
Gabe?
Yep.
Did you just take it to 11? Is this 11? Just be honest with me.
This is it? I mean, it's dependent on you. Does it feel like an 11?
I mean, I don't know how much higher you could take it. This is pretty bad.
So is this 100 out of 100? Is that what you're saying?
We're pushing 80 and 90. Yeah, this is up there.
Well, let's stop here whenever you're ready.
So those units they're using right now, where he's like, is this 100? Those are called SUDs, subjective units of distress. And 100 is the highest, 0 is the lowest.
Yeah, I would say go ahead and take that
Sure.
headset off.
Whoa, hi.
Yeah, hey, welcome back.
What's up?
Yeah. So, yeah, how was that for you?
So it felt realer than I thought it would.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it's still different than actually being there,
Sure.
right? But it's impractical to go there.
Yeah.
And so this really kind of bridges us between, office-based imaginal exposure, where I just ask you to imagine it, and being there.
Dr. Aronovich says that properly treating my fear of heights could take a few months of VR sessions. Considering I figured I'd have to be terrified of ledges for the rest of my life, that doesn't sound so bad.
So VR has actually been around essentially since we've had manageable computers. So like the 90s, they started doing some of it. I mean, I'll have to try to find the other clip. I realized I should have put this one in. I'll try to find it for next Tuesday. But there's a clip of in the 90s, like really boxy VR, like it's for spider phobia. And I mean, the spider kind of looks like this with some legs on it, right? Like it doesn't look that real. And yet they show people actually like reacting to it. And that it actually helps. So even though, like the doctor said, it's not perfect, it's not like you're there, it's enough that it works, which is really cool. So I think that this is really the future. You can also do VR for PTSD, for like combat PTSD. They can actually reconstruct the scenario you were in, which is really interesting. In terms of medications, biological approaches, they are going to use medications. So you can be on like a long-term one, but there are also fast-acting ones that you can take if you are going to be exposed to your feared stimulus. So benzodiazepines, MAOIs that we talked about when we talked about depression, those do have the adverse side effects, and you also can't have like red wine and cheese. And then SSRIs actually work a lot here too as well, increasing that brain serotonin, helping reduce anxiety symptoms when approaching those feared stimuli. Actually, give me just a sec, because now that I think about it, I think I might, you never know, but I think I might have pulled that video with the boxy spider and stuck it on my Google Drive. So let me take a look here. No, I have the elevator one, but not that one. Okay, I will find it. All right, as I mentioned, social anxiety disorder was previously called social phobia because it's so similar in its symptomology to a specific phobia. But I think they changed the name to really recognize that social situations are a generally common part of human existence, right? We tend to be pack animals, we're social creatures. And so this affects us in a profoundly different way than like being afraid of spiders does. So this is when someone has a disabling fear of social situations because they believe they'll act in a manner that will embarrass themselves or that they'll be criticized by others because of how they behave. So people with social phobias tend to avoid social situations, again, getting that negative reinforcement. And because they don't expose themselves to the social situations, they don't learn the social skills to know how to act naturally in those situations. And so for that reason, their performance in work and social situations and school tends to be significantly impaired. Two stars that are pretty interesting that have this are singers Barbra Streisand and Carly Simon. Barbra Streisand, apparently hers is so bad, she had them build a whole mall beneath her house so she doesn't have to go out shopping. I think this was before like Amazon or internet shopping existed. And this can interfere with their ability to perform. All right, this next one, this is one of my favorite psychology related content creators. His name is Dr. Ali Mattu. I've met him in person. He's like a genuinely nice dude. But he's going to talk about how you overcome social anxiety.
Dr. Ali, what's the fastest way I can overcome social anxiety disorder? Finish this sentence. I'm afraid people will think I am weird. Let's pretend that's true. You're weird. What's difficult about that? No one will want to be around me. Ah, so you'll be rejected. Then what might happen? I'll be alone. The fastest way to overcome this core fear of being alone is to learn how to stay connected to people when you feel weird and are worried about being rejected. How do I do that? Exposure therapy, by intentionally putting yourself into situations where you feel weird, learning how to experience that anxiety in a healthy way, maintaining eye contact with others, getting feedback, and then repeating that whole process in other situations.
And so we're getting a little head into therapy, but I just thought that this was a really nice clip to show that this is common and it's something that we have techniques that they really work for it.
Dr. Ali, what's the fastest?
So these are the symptoms, the criteria. So marked, disproportionate, persistent fear or anxiety. Oh, hey, we just saw those exact words. So maybe look at specific phobia, right? So you see the parallel here. But here it's about one or more social situations to which the individual is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. So it's typically things like public speaking, as you saw in the VR video, or like being at parties, having to schmooze with people you don't know, things along those lines. And so that fear of being negatively evaluated or of being offensive to others unintentionally will again get in the way of you being able to even go into these situations, B, act sort of quote unquote whatever normal is, right, in those situations. And anxiety is almost always produced by exposure to that social situation. So you'll avoid that feared stimulus, even if it's to the detriment of, say, a grade in a course. And you'll experience significant distress or impairment. So fear of speaking in public, I would say, is probably the most common version of this. But sometimes there's just a fear of interacting with others, a fear that like everybody's talking about you when you walk into a room, something along those lines. So what causes social phobia, social anxiety? Again, it's kind of a mixed bag of things that we see. And so it is, there's certainly behavioral things that this is probably learned in some ways. So if you have genuinely had the experience where you've gone to do social speaking and public speaking and you've bombed, right? And people did make fun of you, that's going to reinforce it, right? Or if you were someone who was bullied or teased as a kid, right? That's going to play into it. Observational learning. If your parents don't like speaking in public or other people close to you, you might kind of learn by association. And then having those deficits in social skills. Again, the less we interact with other people, the more awkward it is for us to interact with other people. That's why when we all came out of quarantine, no one knew how to talk to each other anymore, right? We've gotten better, but it was super awkward for a little bit. SNL even did a sketch about it. So these are things that can come into play as well. This is something that a lot of folks were worried about for kids who were born during the pandemic. My kiddo had a pragmatic speech delay where she had great vocabulary, but didn't know how to like talk to other kids. And, you know, about 6 sessions of speech therapy, turned her little language centers on. She's great now. But her speech therapist told us she had kids who had literally never played with another kid that she was working with because they were born in 2020. Just like heartbreaking and hard to wrap your head around, right? In terms of the cognitive perspective, cognitive distortions involving that overestimation of negative evaluation by other people, right? Particularly at parties, most people don't care. If you're doing a class presentation, probably everyone in there is almost as anxious as you are and like doesn't care if you mess up, particularly by the time you get to college, right? Y'all are just like, whatever, it's fine. Or they try to support each other. But when you have this disorder, it does not feel like that. You feel like everybody is judging. The biological perspective argues that social fears and phobias might have an evolutionary context, right? If you were weird, if you were judged, you might be thrown out of your tribe or nation or cave, right? And early peoples did not survive well on their own, right? It was really hard to survive without a community. Genetic factors do seem to be a part of this, some sort of temperament issue. And as we've talked about before, there's probably some sort of like diathesis stress here where you have a biological vulnerability and then that translates into the actual disorder if a stressful situation arises. So these are the similar diagram to the GAD ones, but for social phobia. So again, some sort of vulnerability, you have the stressors like we were just talking about. Again, if you've had direct experience being bullied, being taunted, really bombing at a party, that's going to give you a true alarm. You can even have a false alarm associated with sort of overacting that will play into this learned alarm. But if you have perceived poor social skills, even without that alarm, it's going to play into this anxious apprehension and a specific psychological vulnerability, in particular, this thought that social evaluation is dangerous. and therefore something I need to avoid. And that's gonna play into social phobia. All right, we will stop there and we will pick up on the treatments for social phobia on Tuesday. Everybody have a great weekend. Thank you, especially Zoom people, for hanging in through all of our technological issues. Thank you in-class people for being flexible and switching rooms. I emailed the help desk, so hopefully they'll fix the computer next door.